Mia Gloria Fides. That is the Rockingham family motto, meaning faith is my glory. And it stands tall and proud above the Corinthian portico right behind me, here at Wentworth Woodhouse. But Rockingham is a tiny village and a castle 100 miles away here, for we're standing in Wentworth in South Yorkshire. So what links a small Yorkshire village and a even smaller Northamptonshire town? Well, new research has found that the families that resided here and the wider communities have links all across the country to even the most unexpected of places. More than that though, new research has also indicated that it has links across the globe to small villages in Central America, all the way to Africa and Asia. This documentary is our way of trying to challenge the preconceived notion that whilst this was a cornerstone of the local community, it also plays a wider and huge part of a global community. The connection this small Yorkshire village has and this grand house has to the tiny village of Rockingham is owed to the builder and owner of this house, Thomas Watson Wentworth, the first Marquess of Rockingham. His father, who was of the Watson family lineage, was a descendant of one of the first owners of Rockingham Castle, which is there at the village of Rockingham. He passed the title of Baron down through his lineage to Thomas Watson Wentworth, of Baron of Rockingham, and thus in the 1740s, when he was christened a Marquess by the King, Thomas Watson Wentworth was actually christened as a Marquess of Rockingham because of that Rockingham Castle lineage. But this small village in South Yorkshire also has connections to Central America. Landed gentry and rich families were kind of obsessed with exploring the world, and the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam, who resided here in the early 1900s, was no different. He was described as being a bit of a little adventurer, and in 1904 he and a few others went on an expedition to the very tiny, very remote Cocos Islands in Central America. Now, they went there in search of supposed buried treasure, and whilst they never really found what they were looking for, what the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam did actually get was a near-death experience, as he was very, very close to one of the mining operations, to one of the exploring techniques that they used, which was exploding dynamite to try and destroy the local surroundings to find what they wanted. He did survive, but it does show that small villages and even big stately homes like this and the families that resided there have connections all across the globe, even to unsuspecting tiny islands like the Cocos Islands. But speaking of America, the families here at Wentworth Woodhouse also have a connection to the USA. Charles Watson Wentworth, the first Prime Minister from Yorkshire who resided here, was an avid supporter of the colonies and didn't really like the way they were treated. In 1765, he helped repeal the Stamp Act to try and lessen the burden they paid in taxes. For his support, they actually named a county in America called Rockingham in his honour. They also have a town called Wentworth that was also named after him too. But the wider community of Rotherham in general was also quite sympathetic to the colony's treatment. The nearby Thomas Howard, the 3rd Earl of Effingham, was a neutralist and he didn't support nor go against the colonies, but he too voiced how he disliked how they were being treated. And for his support, they actually named a city in Illinois called Effingham in his honour. And he also named his hunting lodge Boston Castle, after the Boston Tea Party, to show that they did have his continuing support. It's very interesting to see that centuries later, these small villages in South Yorkshire really do still have a living connection to America. So new research has found connections between Wentworth Woodhouse and the families that resided here and the local community, and America, Central America, Ireland and the rest of England. But new research carried out by other researchers has also found connections to Africa, Asia, Australia and more. And we're here today to go and talk to them and find out what they've learnt.
Well, I was particularly interested in Charles Watson Wentworth. He was Prime Minister um, in 1765 for 1 year, and then again in 1782 for 6 months, shortly before he passed away. And so, because he was PM at that time, I was particularly interested in finding out the links he had with the East India Company and the South Asia. It was a private company, it was a commercial company really, but it kind of over a period of time, the government had more and more say in how it was run. And this is what was quite significant with Charles Wentworth, because he was he was PM at a time when the government was trying to basically get a bit more of the action. So they were kind of, the company was making lots of money. They were there was kind of there was lots of corruption going on as well. I found some political kind of papers in terms of letters from the company into to Charles Wentworth, going back and forth. I mean, for example, he did have a holding, he did have stocks in the East India Company, not very many stocks, but that's one of the things I was looking at to find, whether, in terms of the wealth that Wentworth would have, whether that came from, for example, the East India Company in any way. So I think we can say that didn't really happen in a significant way. For example, at Wentworth Woodhouse, so there was this idea of how did these plants actually get here. I mean, you have to remember that at the time, in the 18th century, it would take a year for ships to kind of actually travel all the way here. So anything that you were kind of exporting, it would take quite a long time. And in the archives, I found a specific letter from Bahania Gardens in Calcutta. And this was a botanic gardens in Calcutta that had sent a parcel of seeds to Charles Watson Wentworth, to kind of Wentworth Woodhouse. And so this was quite significant because we can trace the fact that with this one letter and this parcel of seeds, obviously it proves one way of seeds arriving here. So if that's, this allows us to kind of look for more evidence in terms of how other plants and seeds might have. So Nathaniel Wallish was superintendent of the Calcutta Botanic Gardens, and he held this position from 1815 to 1846, so more than 30 years. And this was a really important position to hold. It was like the most important botanical position, if you like, in the East India Company. And so we know that he actually sent plants and seeds all across the world. I mean, he distributed them across India as well. So there was this idea of botanical kind of elements kind of improving people. I mean, much the way that museums kind of improved kind of the ordinary person, there was this idea of kind of in civil society you would kind of distribute these plants. So he did that. He also distributed them to universities and various people studying. And then also he actually distributed them to elites. So one of the themes that they're looking at is tea, and the whole idea of tea is something that's universal and drunk, all across the world. And it starts from this kind of camellia plant, and it starts in China. And I think these are really lovely kind of themes to look at, and in terms of it's something that connects everyone really. But I think what we shouldn't forget is that the politics behind it, and I think we can actually use something even as duplicitous as tea to look at the colonial connections, and to look at how this arrived in this. I don't think we should forget the colonial violence and the labor that was extracted, and the products that were extracted from India. And I think this kind of research allows us to look at that. So whilst I think we should look at the themes that are that bind us today, we shouldn't forget about the difficult history, and we shouldn't kind of shy away from addressing that, because I think people can face up to that. It's not wagging a finger at anyone, because we're living in contemporary times. it's just a way of addressing that this history exists.
Darcy Wentworth was born in Portadown in Ireland. He was a part of a family that had migrated at the time of the battle of the Battle of the Boyne, I suppose, to Ireland. But they had also some of the Wentworths had moved to America and moved to Ireland as a consequence of the beheading of the Earl of Strafford, because they feared for their own lives too, and that was a cause for some. And there was Wentworths in Hampshire and in parts of America, but also they came. Obviously, he was born in Ireland as a consequence of them going to Ireland. He was trained as Darcy was trained as a surgeon in Ireland, and he served as an ensign in the Ulster Volunteers during the time of the American Revolution.
So I actually haven't been able to find them directly benefiting. So they definitely were not plantation owners. They didn't own any slaves. I've gone through, UCL have a really extensive legacies of slavery database when once all the plantation owners were filing for compensation, that's where you can find a lot of slave owners' names, and they're not cropping up on that system, which is a positive thing. But on the flip side, they were definitely benefiting from the exploitation of African people and the whole entirety of the transatlantic slave. I didn't find that Charles Watson Wentworth was particularly vocal in his opposition to slavery at the time. He definitely wasn't pro-slavery, but as I said, he wasn't particularly vocal. He did position himself on the side of the abolitionists at the time, but it wouldn't be until 1788 when the first Slave Trade Act was eventually passed. Obviously, he became PM in 1765, so there's a good 20 years worth of work where not really much was happening. And again, I didn't find him particularly involved in the cause. It was his next descendant, William Fitzwilliam. He was involved in the 1807 Yorkshire elections, which William Wilberforce was also running in, and obviously that name today is synonymous with the abolition of slavery. And in Yorkshire, William Wilberforce was kind of a poster boy. He was kind of looked at as a new kind of politician. Obviously, he wasn't like the Wentworth family, coming from decades before and from money, and it seemed that the locals really got on side with Wilberforce, and I kind of saw Fitzwilliam as kind of following in his footsteps almost. So as I described it, they were abolitionists, but they weren't really heavily campaigning against. The Wentworths were really keen to be involved in the latest trends of the time, something that we could equally be accused of today. Having the latest mobile phone or the latest clothes, and people not getting paid very well. So there's things like sugar, chocolate, the consumption of tea and coffee. All of these things would have been grown by African people at some point. And then you also have the trade in plants and animals. So there's quite an extensive record of animals being shipped over from Africa, which would have been housed in Wentworth. Things like a chimpanzee, they were dressing up and giving port wine to. So obviously that wasn't the best care of an animal at the time. And again, it was very much to show off and show how cultured you were at the time, bringing your friends around your garden and saying, look at all these exotic birds and creatures that I have. The pineapple, which has been quite a favourite of mine during this research. So the pineapple would have originated in South America, but the Europeans would have largely first come across it being cultivated in the Caribbean. So again, highly likely that it would have been being grown by enslaved African people. And then you had this trend of naturalists at the time coming over, taking samples of plants and obviously seeds and cuttings, and then taking that back to Europe. And it would have been the enslaved people introducing them to these plants again, and pretty much showing them what they were and how to grow them and keep them. And this is where the pineapple was picked up in the Caribbean, taken over to Europe, and became, basically they called it pineapple fever. They were growing so many pineapples at Wentworth Woodhouse at one time. At one point they were growing 16 per day. And they were so popular that they would end up renting them because it just became such a status. So one quite strong link, I would say, is a Henry Friday. He was first mentioned in a PhD thesis back in the 80s. So he was recorded as being a servant, a black boy servant, he's described as, in the record books at Wentworth. This was in 1770. I did a little bit more digging and I managed to find his baptism records, which was in 1768, and he was baptised in the village of Wentworth. Going a little bit further with that, it seemed again that it was a massive trend of the aristocrats to have black servants, because again it showed off how cultural they were, that they were in touch with the African continent. So if again you could show off to your friends, look, I have a black servant, that was something quite trendy at the time. But it does seem that these servants would have been youngsters. Henry Friday may well have been 10 years old when he was brought over.
Volunteers and consultants have been also exploring the archives and contributing their research to build a greater understanding of how goods came to arrive at Wentworth Woodhouse, and to set the context for family and political life in the 18th and 19th centuries at the house. This includes the importation of tea, exotic animals, and camellias.
Because we've discovered that the Camellia House stored has actually got camellias that it wasn't known had travelled to England, and at a very early date. We don't yet know what part in the early 18th century they arrived here, but from camellia you make tea. Now it's quite possible the ones we've got at Wentworth are more the decorative species rather than the tea producing species, because when they were being imported particularly from China and Japan, they didn't want to lose their monopoly on production, so they weren't going to allow it to happen elsewhere. But the fact Wentworth has got camellias at a very early part in the 18th century, and there's other evidence which shows this interest in new goods, new commodities, far beyond just consuming them. Well, where did they come from? How were they prepared? What's the rituals? What does it do for you? That's quite significant to Wentworth. And there's a trail through the 18th and 19th centuries of a key interest of various family members at quite a high scientific level with horticulture and new commodities coming in. So the ability to have tea and socialise was very important here, and that was often a feminine activity. And there's lots of cartoons of the time where male satirists, George Cruikshanks for example, Jonathan Swift, were taking against women gathering together, drinking tea in the afternoon in their own homes, because they'd talk, they'd gossip, it would be scandalous, we're not too sure about this. In the early 18th century, the main tea that came in was green tea. And there were different categories. There were two types. There was black tea, green tea. Black tea had a generic term called Buhia, and there was Congo tea. And then for the green teas, there was Dutch, there was hyssop, There were all sorts of different types. A lot of it depended on who was getting it, whether it was the Dutch East Indies or the English East Indian Company. They were going out to China. They thought they could monopolise it. They didn't quite realise how big China was, I don't think. And they both went out there thinking, if we buy all the tea, we've got the monopoly in Europe. Tea was imported from China, from Japan, came to England, and then it went to America, and that caused a lot of annoyance because we taxed it. The Dutch were undercutting us, so black market set up there of buying tea without taxation. We then reduced the taxes on tea, but didn't abolish them. That's what actually generated the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and that famous phrase, no taxation without representation. And you got what was the equivalent of about $1 million worth of tea dumped into Boston Harbour. It was a big thing at the time. What a lot of people don't know is that also it generated an embargo on drinking tea. People in America said, right, if they're going to tax it, we won't consume it. And there are comments saying you would not believe how the use of tea has just dropped so phenomenally in America because they were protesting against the taxation on it. We use the term boycott. The word boycott hadn't been invented in the 19th century, but that's exactly in the 18th century. But that's really what they were doing. And that's interesting because people in England were becoming aware of how sugar was being produced with the slave trades in America, and were beginning to get very uncomfortable about that. So after the Boston Tea Party, the late 1770s, there was a boycott in England of sugar to protest against the conditions and slave trade. It didn't work as well as the one in America, purely because at the time it was gaining ground in England, and houses such as Wentworth, down to middling sorts, were saying, no, we'll go without sugar. They got black tea coming in by that time, and that wasn't as bitter as green tea, and so they could say, we can do without sugar, we'll just put milk in it. But the French lost their sugar plantations due to riots in Haiti, and so they just switched the English production to France. And so as a boycott, it didn't work as well as the tea boycott in America did. But it shows this growing awareness by the third quarter of the 18th century. People in England were becoming uncomfortable when they were realising how these commodities they were consuming were being produced.
Records of a brown bear from America. They had ostrich, they had emus, they had armadillos, you name it. They had an ocelot, which is a wild cat. They even had a kangaroo with a joey in its pouch, and llamas. Now the llamas were brought from Arica in Chile, and brought over here in the 1830s and 40s. And in the Rotherham Gazette, I think it's 1849, there's an account and it said something like, an extraordinary birth at Wentworth Woodhouse. And it said, the noble Earl Fitzwilliam, who is in possession of a female and male llama, and the female had given birth to a young one. And it said it was perfectly white and healthy in appearance. And you just hope that this poor creature survived, because sadly, a few years later, Charles Cooper was being paid for cleaning and mounting the skeleton of a llama.
Really interesting doing the research, because we've been able to turn up some sort of tantalising glimpses of what might have happened, but there's also quite a lot that's still to find out. So, for example, we know from the Camellia Society that the camellias are really old, probably a couple of 100 years old. So what I've been trying to do is delve into the archive and can I find references in letters from, for example, a second Marchioness about planting the camellias or camellias being in the gardens, or from then the Lord Milton, as he was before he inherited the estate. And it's been really interesting because it's been fascinating. They were several generations of the family were really avid plant collectors, but so far I have not yet been able to find a specific mention of camellias. So that's one of the kind of exciting things about the research. I think we've just started, and we know that these camellias are really significant, and that the family were really significant plant collectors, collecting plants from all over the world. But there's still a lot more to find out. So it's exciting.
Research is helping Wentworth Woodhouse to prepare their strategies for regenerating the Camellia House, connecting South Yorkshire communities and making history a part of its new life.
What is the plan now moving forward for the Camellia House?
It's to become a facility for the gardens, but it's going to be a specialty tea house. So we will specialise in teas from across the world, and we will run various community events there so that we understand how people take tea in different communities, not just different from different ethnicities, but different communities, you know, within our own direct sort of landscape, and within our own region, and within our own country, and globally.
New research has shown that Wentworth Woodhouse had a global reach, and the families that resided there played an important part on the global stage. But the work is not over yet. There is more work to be done at the Camellia House, and there is more outreach to be done with the global communities across the world. New research has shown Wentworth Woodhouse in a new perspective, and with new perspectives come new possibilities.